That's what she'll talk about.
Thank you. I feel like I should give my talk time back to Zach because we could talk about that for so long. Same with Giovanni, but I'm selfish, I won't do that. So Zach asked the question, how many architects in the room? How many neuroscientists in the room? Okay. So then how many in between? I love that. I love that we are entering a world of so many people who are really, truly in between. So I come from the practice world. I direct research for a large 1,400-person firm and also have a chance to teach at the University of Michigan. This question of can you really study the brain in building? And for the neuroscientists, I ask for your indulgence in this session. Think very broadly about our definition of the brain here. Be kind to the practitioners, because it's a very broad definition that we're using, but can you really study the brain in building in real-life settings? And that came up in some of the questions. This was published this morning by the behavioral scientist, and I thought it was a great quote to start with. It was a paper in the behavioral scientist published this morning that talked about why behavioral scientists should partner with design. And this is a quotation from the paper. By partnering with design and framing behavioral science as a speculative tool, in addition to an evidence-based one, we can collectively better envision the new, in addition to testing the old. It's a great paper if you want to read it up, because it talks about all that we can learn from behavioral science as designers, all that behavioral science can learn from design, and where those two paradigms come together. So just this idea that, and in practice we face this all the time, that oftentimes the evidence is seen as a prescriptive tool that tells you what to do, but by the time the evidence gets to you, the evidence has changed. And the decisions that you make in practice are so complex and so interdependent that it's very difficult unless we are able to embrace both the speculative and the confirmatory aspects of our field. So in that vein, what we tried a couple of years ago, and I have some of my colleagues today in the audience, is we tried developing a lab of ourselves in our office with 500 designers. And it's a very broad definition of a lab. It's a design lab. The idea is that between your define, design, and deliver phase, when you design, can you get into a think, make, test paradigm? What if designers had agency to think about testing their design solutions all the time? That's a culture shift. I can't do randomized control trials. I cannot really dig deep. I lean on my academic collaborators to do that. But how do I at least get curious about it? How do I start thinking that every time I make a design decision, it's a performance hypothesis? How do I start articulating my design decisions in terms of clear intent and hopefully meaningful and measurable impact? So that was the idea. That, so some of the things we played around with, and Jonathan's in the audience and can talk to you about it, is we did VR, but a lot of our projects were doing VR, and then some of our projects were doing mock-ups, full-scale mock-ups. Said, well, neither seems to meet the goals. What happens if we try mixed reality? How much of a difference to a VR experience do you have if you can actually sit physically in that space and feel it? Again, just something that was exploratory. A lot of rapid prototyping and a lot of discovery around how do we measure outcomes. What can we really do, which sometimes can be down and dirty, cannot be highly controlled, but can we really start to measure outcomes, or at least for our scientific colleagues, articulate what outcomes we can impact so that those can be measured more rigorously. That's first step. So we tried with this lab, and we realized that the biggest challenge with having a lab is that it's not on site. Right? So when you're designing real environments, and that question keeps coming up, saying, can you really get people engaged in this culture of experimentation if they're in real life sites? We had an opportunity come up at the same time, which was around a school that was redesigned. It was renovated. It was Dallas ISD, and they were trying personalized learning. And what they were doing is completely rethinking how classrooms should be designed. So your typical arena-type seating was being rethought. The furniture was being rethought. There were multiple small hypotheses within it. Traditionally, what would we do? We would go back into a post-occupancy evaluation, right? So we did that. We did a post-occupancy evaluation. We realized that there are some issues with flexibility that just wasn't working for the students. Students were getting distracted very easily with flex spaces. And then we had this crazy idea that what happens if in that real life setting, I try to set up a more experimental setting with a pop-up lab. So this was our experiment, right? So we did a post-occupancy evaluation. We did pre and post comparisons. But we also said, what would happen if I could really set up a control space there and look at only one parameter, which for us as designers, the most urgent at that point was furniture layout. It also happened to be who sponsored the study. But so this was the concept, saying a pop-up lab. The idea that can I pop up a space where I can control one variable at a time, down and dirty, but since everything changes simultaneously, and I can say, okay, this bundled intervention is better than this bundled intervention, but I can't isolate it, can I, in a real life setting, pop up a little lab where the idea is you develop a sensory design lab, rapidly deployed in real life settings that measures human response, and we looked at just heart rate, anxiety, and behavior, 2 interior design elements in real time. This was pilot tested, and I cannot say pilot test enough number of times because we made every single mistake possible, like every single mistake possible. But we were curious, we tried it. And the idea was to pilot test it in a local high school to measure the effects of furniture choice and arrangement and environmental conditions where we were looking at sound, temperature, light, on heart rate, self-reported anxiety, achievement, and movement. We were very lucky. We got a small grant to set us off. We had some internal funds. We had a very collaborative client with the Dallas Independent School District and a lot of research partners. And this is the team. Jonathan is actually here and will be presenting a poster later. It took us time. So as a researcher in the design world, I thought I would go up to the architects and say, I want a pop-up lab. I want it to come up in 2-3 hours, and I want you to do it in 2 days. And I thought it was really simple, and it wasn't. It wasn't that easy for us to really develop this idea of a rapidly deployable, fully trackable space. So there was a lot of research that was just construction-based that they did. We also realized we're not experts in sensor technology, and anything off the shelf was not giving us access to the data we needed. So our computational designers landed up developing sensors using Arduino and a couple of other softwares so that we could get access to environmental sensor data. And really, it landed up looking very rough and ready for 2 reasons. One, we needed it to be an agnostic prototype, which means it wasn't a single vendor. It was no particular manufacturing unit that does not talk to other things. So we landed up with like grid beam and foam core and 3D printed segments from it. We had 3 key requirements. It has to be flexible, it has to be trackable, it has to be portable. I should be able to change elements within it. I should be able to track what happens to the humans within it. I should be able to transport it very quickly. And it was around 10 by 10 by 8. We couldn't afford a ceiling, so there's no ceiling. Hopefully, thankfully, the world comes with floors, so we could get the floors. And again, like I said, a quick wood beam structure, a grid beam structure, which is very flexible, and then 3D printed in-house elements to hold boards. And then we went to the school, and while the students in high school were studying, we took a little room, and we set it up, and we timed it. It took us exactly 2 hours to set up this room within a room. And it was really crazy for us to explain to the admin, saying, I know we have a room, but I want to make sure only one thing changes in that room when the students come into it. So we landed up making a room within a room, which only thing we changed in this little minor experiment was the furniture configuration. And a question was very simple again, saying furniture selection and layout, does that impact psychological and physiological outcomes in a learning space? Because it was all around personalized learning. We had an interesting setup. All students have 30 minutes of learning lab time. That's what their time is called. I didn't make that up. And they could get to go into our lab for 30 minutes as they did it. It could be a single student, groups of 2, or groups of 3. Before they went in, we gave them a self-report instrument. So this was the data we collected. We had our in-house manufactured sensors for lighting, humidity, temperature, and sound. We used a Fitbit for heart rate and movement. And we used thermal cameras because we needed a way of gathering movement data without invading privacy. So we used thermal imaging and worked out quite well. 30 students, 17 groups, very short 30-minute sessions, and over 10 days. The pre-experiment, before they went in, they were asked about how are you feeling, are you anxious, are you not anxious, and the instrument on the top is a well-validated state trait anxiety inventory. Instrument on the bottom is something that we really made up. It's not validated, and hopefully the data will help us do that. We asked them, what do you hope to accomplish in the next half hour? What is your hope? And when they came out, we asked them the same question, but most importantly, did you do what you hoped to do in those 30 minutes? Very simple. So same questions posed, and then what did you achieve your goals? What kept you from achieving your goals? How did you arrange the room and why, etc. So we had all types of data. We had a little bit of data greed going in. And so we had self-reported data. We had all the humidity, sound, temperature, lighting levels, self-reported achievement, movement, and then the video data. And then we discovered how much time it takes and how much noise there is in sensor data. We also realized that you can't time sample very carefully. And like I said, if anyone wants to have a sidebar conversation with me about what not to do with sensors, I'm your best person to talk to. I feel like we did a whole study on what not to do. But this is what we landed up using: self-reported anxiety, sound, temperature, self-reported achievement, and then the video data. And again, bear in mind, this is a pilot. We are trying out this idea that students are going into a controlled environment. The only thing they're changing within it is the furniture layout. Our postdoc analyzed all of that video thermal imaging data and did behavior coding. We did it manually. I do not want to share how many hours it took. But it was a very intensive process because we realized that those behavior codes didn't exist in the literature anywhere that we could use automatically. Right? So when you're looking for instruments that you can use, and then you're in the complexity of real-life studies, sometimes you don't have the tools you need. And you jerry-rig them. And you come back and you ask for your academic colleagues for forgiveness and hope that someone else will take it up and look further. But we had some findings which were very interesting. For example, students who were in groups of 3, not those who went in alone, not in groups of 2, but students in groups of 3 personalize the space more. So what happens is, if I'm alone or with just one person, I adapt to the environment. Once I'm 3 or perhaps larger, I want the environment to adapt to me, and I do more things to change furniture around. If you notice large group meetings, you'll tend to see that too. People will start rearranging furniture if there's a critical mass. So again, not generalizable, but a very interesting finding for us as architects. The other thing that ties to visual prospect, which was also very interesting, is that students who face the entrance, so we only had one entrance looking out, those who face the entrance reported higher self-achievement than those who face the back wall. And all the results that I'm sharing, even though it's a small sample size, are statistically significant. Right, so this was also interesting because it ties back to visual prospect. There's a lot of research around visual prospect. And our mini experiment validated those. And then, of course, the type of furniture that they preferred. But the first two were very interesting to us. We also found something related to acoustics, that overall, the students were in this open environment. They went into this lab for 30 minutes. Overall, their anxiety reduced, although we hadn't done anything specifically in design to reduce anxiety. But there was a drop in anxiety. However, given that drop, those students, when the sound levels were higher, the drop in anxiety was lower. You don't see that much of a drop if it was loud. But you saw a more significant drop when it was slightly quieter. And that by itself is also good, supports previous literature around acoustics. What was fun was we also found out that if it's too quiet, students fidget. And students fidget all the time. The other part of this body of work is the amount of multitasking behaviors that we saw. So it's a miracle we get anything done. But they fidget more. And when they fidget, their anxiety drops, but their achievement does not improve. So they do calm down when they fidget. And I give my boys fidget toys all the time, but I'm realizing now that that may not be helping them focus. It just helps them get calm. But again, we don't know where these findings go. So we're going to go back to the world we understand better, which is design implications, right? And we're hoping that there would be interest in these findings from a more cognitive science perspective. So the first thing, visual prospect. We know it's important, we validate that, but really importantly to articulate that having visual prospect can contribute to, not predict, but can contribute to cognitive performance. And so we need sufficient space allowing seating and orientation where you have view. Just a simple takeaway for designers to say, allow visual prospect in your designs of the schools. The second is around personalization of group spaces. If any of you design schools, you'll know that the trend right now is uber flexibility, and we are starting to create a lot of flexibility in all the spaces. But maybe we might be overdoing that a little bit. Maybe the group space is needed, but there may be some value to arena-style spaces for lectures where it's a one-to-one engagement. So again, something to think through, an implication that we have to study in more detail. And finally, to think about sound as soundscape design, not just reducing sound levels. If it's too low, it doesn't work. If it's too high, it doesn't work. There is a design opportunity in acoustics that we have to think through. So that was our mini experiment with this little pop-up lab. And it had a bunch of limitations. We have used a wood framing system. The fidelity was terrible. The designers were so mad at me because it did not look pretty at all. So we have to develop more sensors. We had a lot of issue with sensor syncing, and the sample size, 30 students, not a huge sample. But we learned so much. We learned so much, and most importantly, we learned that designers can have agency in this idea of experimentation. That they are the ones who are giving hypotheses. They are the ones who are saying, I'm doing this because I think this is going to happen. Can we test it? Can we measure it? And we had other opportunities. So we took that same lab and we took it to South by Southwest, and it looked completely different. Same framing system. But now it becomes a design opportunity to play with saying, if I wanted to study openings, I could use the same system and play with that in that way. We took it back to our lab, and it now sits there. Views, pink and purple lighting has come up for interest, by the way. If anybody knows anything about it, please let me know. Proportion, fractals, beauty, these are some of the things we're interested in. We don't know what to do. But we're interested, and we have that back in our space to just encourage a dialogue. We did land up creating a lab in the bag, which is a little portable kit of sensors for environmental sensors that goes to different spaces. So if you're creating environments, we say, OK, we can't do a full study. Can we at least get the environmental data? And then finally, we have a lot of requests for GSR and EEG sensors, which I personally have been holding back on because we have no idea how to read the data. But just so you know, we're very interested. It's a starting point. And the most exciting thing, there's a poster that we have out there where this project led us to do another project, which was the development of an actual sensory well-being hub for children with cognitive disorders. Sean Alquist, Jonathan Essery will present that poster. And that became a living lab. That was an environment that students have been using for over 9 months now. That is continuously being monitored. And finally, to take it to the biggest level, for us to think about our large project that you will see in the walk later today, the Torrey Pines Live-Learn neighborhood, where we are trying to take it at an even higher level, articulating here are the design hypotheses, what are the outcomes that could happen in a built project, and Matt Smith and Eduardo are working on that with us, the idea that not only do you test, but you learn as you test and as you go. All right. Thank you very much. From pop-up to living to live-learn. I did want to talk to the slide, the fact that I feel like we're kids in a candy store right now. we're so curious, we want to do so many things, we can't do it without partnerships.